start with Rhea's question. Did the civil rights movement fail in any way? Now, of course, this is one of those things I've mentioned in previous sessions. We're talking about facts, opinions, and historical judgments. When we think about, did the civil rights movement fail in any way, what we have to understand, first of all, is that there are many civil rights movements, okay? So when we say like the civil rights movement, it really would probably be better to say the civil rights movements, because there are several players there that have differing goals. And I think that this would be a good point to go ahead and get into the MLK versus Malcolm X kind of thing, okay? Which, of course, there are a lot of different movements within this, but let's go ahead and first of all kind of clarify. It's like, what are the goals of the civil rights movement, okay? And so when we take a look at this, I'm going to go ahead and project this. And when we think about this, you know, two of your most iconic civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, that they are both, okay, when we think about comparing, we want to look at what is it that they're both trying to do in common, okay? So in this case, what is the best approach to solving the problems related to racism in the United States? And so for Martin Luther King Jr., it's about integration. The goal here is integration. Now, one of the things we want to do is we want to be able to tie this in with people who have come before, okay? And so Martin Luther King Jr. is really following the example of W.E.B. Du Bois in the previous generation, one of the founders of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And Martin Luther King started the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. Southern Christian Leadership Conference was just a little bit much for this, but you know what? I think I will go ahead and try to maybe do it in a reduced font. Southern Christian Leadership Conference, okay? And so when you look at this, like, what is it that he's trying to do? What is his objective, okay? And note here that he is, you know, coming from a perspective of a Christian minister in the South, and he wants integration. Now, the two, you know, as far as his methods, okay, so Martin Luther King is using civil disobedience and nonviolence. You know, the two primary sources that would be best here are his I Have a Dream speech and the letter from Birmingham jail. Now, one thing is, when we think about the letter from Birmingham jail, that, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. is really wanting cooperation from sympathetic white liberals. And the letter from Birmingham jail is really directed at that audience, okay? So when we think about a document's context, audience, and purpose, Martin Luther King was in jail, I believe, if my memory served me correctly, for like a traffic violation. One of those things that, you know, nobody gets put in jail for, but it's still technically a violation of the law. And so, okay, we found Martin Luther King with a traffic violation, let's put him in jail. And so he began to write this letter that he smuggled out kind of piece by piece while he was in jail here. And he is writing to people who are always calling for incremental change, like, you know, be patient, be patient, be patient. And of course, the I Have a Dream speech was given in 1963, which was the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And remember that some of the language that's used at this time is archaic. It's not something that we use today, but, you know, he begins his speech. One of the things he says here is that the Negro still is not free, okay? That 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, that Black Americans really still don't know freedom. They still don't know what it's like to have all of the opportunities that other people have in this country. And he has a dream, okay? So his dream is about, you know, everybody, you know, all God's children, Black men and white men, and really is capturing, you know, what I think, you know, what I love about the I Have a Dream speech is that he is really channeling a Jeffersonian kind of element here, like, really reaching into the ideas of the Declaration of Independence and noting that these ideas really should apply to everyone. Now, Martin Luther King wrote a lot of other things that, I mean, I wouldn't consider Martin Luther King a Jeffersonian, but he really, in this speech, he captured, this Jeffersonian element, and he did a really great job of building coalitions. Okay, for example, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was mostly black ministers. Now, that was, largely because it was hard to find white ministers in the South to participate. But there was one guy, Will Campbell, who was a white minister, a white Baptist preacher, who was part of the founding of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So that's something that I don't necessarily have on the organizer here, but we want to note here that Martin Luther King was a cooperationist. He wanted to cooperate with sympathetic whites. Now, Malcolm X gives us another way out here. And this is the way of black nationalism, okay, which today we hear a lot. We hear the term white nationalism thrown around a lot. There really aren't a whole lot of people in this country today that subscribe to like theories of racial nationalism, but we do hear of people out there who they define their nation as people of their color, okay? Now, the thing is that Malcolm X believed he's going back to Marcus Garvey and to a certain extent to Booker T. Washington. Like, what you want to think about is a lineage here. So Martin Luther King, his lineage comes from W.E.B. Du Bois, whereas Malcolm X's lineage, goes through Booker T. Washington to Marcus Garvey to Malcolm X. In fact, Malcolm X's father was a preacher and a Garveyite. He was somebody who was part of Marcus Garvey's mass movement, and Malcolm X's father was brutally murdered. He was basically beaten and thrown onto a train track, and a gruesome death, which ended up driving his mother crazy. And so Malcolm X, and the other thing about Malcolm X is that Martin Luther King was from the South. Like, when you read the autobiography of Malcolm X, you're looking at Northern racism. I mean, this was a white supremacist organization. I forget if it was in Michigan or Wisconsin, but he was up north in the Midwest. And of course, you remember from studying the 1920s that was really, the Midwest was the epicenter of the Second Klan. And so Malcolm X really, instead of talking about integration, Malcolm X wanted the black community to stand up for itself. It kind of goes back to, if you think about Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Exposition speech, or Atlanta Compromise speech, or simply his Atlanta speech, where he said, "Cast down your bucket where you are." Okay, cast down your bucket where you are. And instead of asking for things like asking the white community to include you in this and that and asking to vote, just go ahead and help yourselves. Don't wait for someone to help you. And so early on, now this wasn't Malcolm X, we want to note that he split from the Nation of Islam. Now, let's not confuse the Nation of Islam with actual Islam. It is a different, it is inspired by, kind of a combination of Islam and Christianity. But it is the Nation of Islam was a, and still exists, but it's a black supremacist group that they, Malcolm X, when you read the autobiography of Malcolm X, which was really dictated to Alex Haley over a long period of time, like over a few years. And I would tell, if you haven't had spring break yet, I would say get a hold of the autobiography of Malcolm X and read it. I think former Attorney General Eric Holder said this should be something that every American should read. I agree. This is really one of the best books. Really opened my eyes to a lot of things here. Seeing what Malcolm X experienced as a child. But Malcolm X was involved with the Nation of Islam, which white America classified as a hate group. But at the same time, this group was doing things to help the Black community. And they created this really insulated kind of group where they had their own schools, they had their own supermarkets, they had their own grocery stores, they had their own restaurants. Like there was a, which sometimes the Nation of Islam is referred to as the Black Muslims. But remember, this is distinct from Islam, okay? That mainstream Islam, which Malcolm X converted to later on, this is distinct from that. But there were even restaurants that Malcolm X, and other members of the Nation of Islam where they would eat. So they solved this problem. How do we deal with racism? Black nationalism says that we create our own communities and we don't rely on the white community. And so as far as that goes, it's a different goal. Now, whereas Martin Luther King was big on civil disobedience and nonviolence, okay? So Martin Luther King was an advocate of the doctrine of nonviolence, that, it's okay to resist the law. So for example, like people that went and took part in sit-ins. So when somebody goes and takes part in a sit-in, they know that they're going to get arrested, okay? They know that they're going to get arrested, but they suffer the consequences. It's like you go in there, when somebody shows up and arrests you, you don't argue. So for example, when Martin Luther King was arrested for a parking violation, he didn't fight him, he didn't do anything, he just basically, and this is of course when you think about Martin Luther King as a Christian minister, turning the other cheek. And so he was very committed to the doctrine of nonviolence, whereas Malcolm X was an advocate of self-defense and reciprocity. Now note that I'm not using the word violence, okay, because to characterize Malcolm X as an advocate of violence is really unfair to Malcolm X. I remember, which I don't have the autobiography of Malcolm X here that I can see, but part of Malcolm X's like persona, like when he tried to box, like they tried to put him in boxing when he was younger, he wasn't very good at it. And there was somebody that was eulogizing Malcolm X, and I forget the name of this person, but what he said here is a lot of people like to characterize Brother Malcolm as being violent. But can anybody remember a single, incident where, Malcolm X was violent towards someone? Now, he did have that picture taken of himself, and this was actually directed at the Nation of Islam, where he's got a high-powered rifle, like a so-called assault weapon, and he's looking out the window. He's standing there with this high-powered rifle, and he's looking out the window. Now, the message that is being sent here with Malcolm X looking out the window is that if anyone tries to mess with his family, then he's going to shoot them. All right, that is the message. It's not that I'm going out and I am shooting or anything like that. So as far as that goes, it's just like, he was commenting on some of the stuff happening in Alabama, especially in Birmingham, where the police were sicking dogs on civil rights protesters that were engaging in nonviolent, peaceful protest. And so you see pictures, which these aren't in the public domain. That's kind of the problem right now. As we get into the 20th century, a lot of these photos are not in the public domain. You can find them online, but I can't really show them to you on this, through this medium, because they're copyrighted. And so as far as that goes, Malcolm X said in, I believe it was in the speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, Malcolm X said that if somebody sicks a dog on me, I'm going to kill that dog. All right, that I'm going, you sick a dog on me, I'm going to shoot it. And here's the thing, that this is no different than what Jefferson would have advocated, right? Jefferson and Washington and all of our founding fathers who used violence in order to defend their rights. And all Malcolm X is saying is that as a Black man, I should have the same rights as, Jefferson and Washington. Jefferson, who wrote that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Our freedom was won by a violent revolution. And Malcolm X, all he's saying is, if I have to fight to defend my rights, I am willing to do that. And that's really, I actually went to a museum in New York City, the City Museum of New York, and there was a Jackie Robinson exhibit, which was really cool. And I was reading about how, Jackie Robinson, when a white player could, you see any baseball, any of you like baseball. when the umpire makes a bad call, a player can yell at it's normal for a baseball player to yell at the umpire to contest the call. Jackie Robinson, even though he had a pretty quick temper, he had to learn to hold his tongue. And it was a complete double standard that was applied to Jackie Robinson. And even once other black players were playing in the MLB, they weren't as scrutinized. But if Jackie Robinson yelled at an umpire, then he's being this violent black man who can't control himself. And so we see the same thing here, that Malcolm X in the Ballot or the Bullet, he's saying that we're going to try the ballot box. Okay, this is a 1964 speech, which has actually been rated. What's beautiful about these two speeches is that rhetorical scholars, rhetorical experts have said that the I Have a Dream speech was the greatest speech of the 20th century. The Ballot or the Bullet was the 7th greatest American speech in the 20th century. And all he's saying that we're going to try to get what we want at the ballot box. But if we can't, then we're going to go to the cartridge box. And what's important here too is making sure, a lot of times, when we think about civil rights, like, okay, Martin Luther King and that's it. But I think that they really did complement each other in a way, even though Malcolm X had some harsh words for King at various points, even though they eventually met on one occasion, shook hands and all that. But Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, it's like if people had used the Malcolm X approach, then it would have been very easy for segregationists to say, look, these people are being violent. We need to put this down. Whereas if there weren't the threat of violence somewhere, then maybe there wouldn't have been as much that happened. So what I want to say in response to this question that we've got here, did the civil rights movement achieve its goals? What we want to note here is that, what were the goals? Okay, so depending on what the goals were, and this is where you come in and you have to assess, like, what do you see the goals as, and to what extent have those been accomplished? Now, we could say even now you can cite statistics that certainly, we don't have, income equality, education equality based on race even today. And of course, there even, when you think about the funding of schools and achievement gaps and all of that kind of stuff. So that's definitely, it's an interpretive question, but I hope that what I've said here kind of helps you to get this going. And so, oh my goodness, I mentioned Jefferson, and then all of the Hamilton fans have come out of the woodwork. Oh my Lord! All right. So as far as that, what was one of the major turning points of the civil rights movement? Now, Haley, I'll give you a few turning points of the civil rights movement, okay? Now, one thing I would say that really the first part of the civil rights movement is 1948. I would say, if I were going to say something, I'd say that the civil rights movement began in 1948. And what you're looking at there is the factions of the Democratic Party, okay? That when it comes down to it, the Democratic Party was to a large extent dependent on the American South. Okay, so Southern white voters, and at this time, Black Americans in the South weren't voting. There were a lot of obstacles there. And so the Democratic Party in the South was locked tight. And remember that between Reconstruction and the 1948 election, there was this phenomenon of the solid South, okay? The phenomenon of the solid South. And that the Democratic Party could count on the votes from the South. And because of that, now, if we go back to the New Deal, let's remember with FDR. Now, FDR did create CCC camps for Black CCC camps. He actually funded what became the Tuskegee Airmen, which was funded as an experiment to see if a black man could fly a plane, if a black man was smart enough to fly a plane, and sure enough, they were. And so when you look at World War II and you look at people like the Tuskegee Airmen, and they come back, and Harry Truman, really kind of typifies this sort of divide here. Now, the Democratic Party at this time was divided between, it had a lot of, Southern white conservatives who favored segregation, but also a number of northern white liberals and progressives. And so July 14th, 1948, that was the Democratic National Convention. And what we see here is Hubert Humphrey. Okay, let me go ahead and make that bold. Okay, Hubert Humphrey. So Northern Democrats led by Hubert Humphrey succeeded in putting a strong civil rights plank into the 1948 Democratic platform. And so before that, see, FDR, for example, I think I lost my train of thought there for a second, but FDR was, he was making black CCC camps and funding the Tuskegee Airmen and other things, but FDR never advocated against racial segregation in the South. FDR was a politician, and he knew how to keep the party in line. He wanted to hold together this New Deal coalition, which was really, in a lot of cases, somewhat invincible. But Hubert Humphrey says, let us, leave the darkness of states' rights and come into the light of human rights. I don't know if I've directly quoted him there, but Hubert Humphrey was the Democratic nominee in 1968. He was defeated by Richard Nixon. Of course, Richard Nixon appealing to conservatives. And so there was a time in the late 60s and then the 70s where the Democrats nominated a series of folks that did not pan out. Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale. Well, wait, was Mondale? Sorry, I think Mondale was 1984. But anyway, McGovern. Okay, McGovern. That was, so 1972, you had Nixon versus 1972 election. Okay, and that was Richard Nixon versus, yes, George McGovern. Okay, so as far as that goes, yeah, Richard Nixon versus George McGovern. Sorry about that. And so just to make a long story short here, that now the Democratic platform, 1948, has a strong civil rights plank. Well, several Southern Democrats walked out of the convention. And what they did is they met in Birmingham and they got together and they created the States' Rights Democratic Party, also known as the Dixiecrats, and they nominated Strom Thurmond for president. Now, the Dixiecrats carried a handful of states, only, South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. And these were states where the party was on the ballot as the Democratic Party. Like Truman was not recognized in those states as the Democratic nominee. Now, Truman, to his credit, he didn't back down. Now, partly to his credit, I think he's doing the right thing here, but also Truman was told that this was the Northern Democrats. Remember that black voters used to vote Republican. And this is really part of why black voters today vote so overwhelmingly Democratic, that on July 26th, even when faced with this rebellion from the Southern conservative wing of his own party, Southern white wing of his own party, that Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which ordered the integration of the United States Armed Forces. Now, what I want to note here is that remember that the Executive Order number is not so important. Okay, don't worry about learning a number. Now, if you're one of those people who can know numbers, you're like, okay, 9981, I've got a way to remember that. That's great. But if you write Truman signed an executive order which ordered the integration of the armed forces, that is enough. Okay, so we see here in 1948, we see really the first cracks in the edifice of the Democratic Party, which was this coalition during the New Deal of Southern whites, of Northern immigrants, racial minorities in the North, and urban populations in general. And it really was a strong coalition, but in 1948, it began to break. And you start to see over decades a realignment of the South, with the Republican Party. And so with that, I think that is one major turning point there. Okay, now, of course, another major turning point is Brown v. Board. Okay, Brown versus the Board of Education. That's something that is another turning point here because the Supreme Court for the first time has, let's see, All right. Yeah. Now, one thing I wouldn't call like Booker T, I'd be very careful about calling Booker T. Washington a black nationalist. Like, I wouldn't quite, I would say that Marcus Garvey is really like into black nationalism. Booker T. Washington was really, from what I understand, more of a go with the flow kind of guy. That it's like, whites wanted to be separate. And so with that, Booker T. Washington's going with the flow. I don't think, I wouldn't put him in the same box as Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X, who are, advocating for black separatism. Just to make that clear. Okay, so then you've got Brown v. Board, because the Supreme Court is finally reversing its position on Plessy v. Ferguson. The other one I would put out there would be the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, because that's something that disillusions a lot of people, because as you noticed here, that Martin Luther King's always advocating nonviolence. He is advocating civil disobedience, and especially a lot of young people who were involved in the movement, they're starting to get impatient. Okay, they're starting to get impatient, and they're just not they're not feeling it. And so 1968 is where you start to see like the Black Panther Party and other groups that are really taking a more of a Malcolm X kind of approach to this rather than Martin Luther King. So if I were looking at major turning points, I would say that the integration of the armed forces and the Democratic platform in 1948, Brown v. Board in 1954, and then the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. All right. So how did the Brown versus Board of Education affect American literature and the public perspective? Okay. Nicholas, I don't know what to say about, your question directly, but since you have, let's see, am I answering that? What's going on here? Okay. So yes, wait, what? Okay, I think I might have accidentally clicked something that I didn't mean to click. Okay, so right now I'm answering, how did the Black Panthers and SNCC portray the civil rights movement to Americans? Okay, now what we want to note here though, is that really we're looking at, let's think about continuity and change over time. Okay, so let me Stokely Carmichael. Okay, let's take a look at Stokely Carmichael, for example. And so as far as that goes, that Stokely Carmichael was originally, okay, so let me go ahead and share the screen here, and we're going to go chat with our friends at Wikipedia here so that you can kind of see where that is. But I think this is a great example of continuity and change over time. Okay, now looks like later he changed his name to Kwame Ture, but Stokely Carmichael was originally involved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Okay, so as far as that goes, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was, or known as SNCC, this was made up of young people. Now when we go to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, this is an organization. It was founded in 1960, but you see by 1976 it's done. And what we want to note here, when we look at the logo for SNCC, notice here, is this Martin Luther King or is this Malcolm X? Is this integrationist or is this black nationalism? And so with this, you see that the logo here is, a black hand and a white hand shaking hands with each other. And so the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is really following Martin Luther King, okay, is really applying that, and it's kind of a branch for young people, all right, founded in 1960. Now, what's going on, though, is that when you go, they did the freedom rides and other things, but what happens here is later on, especially after the assassination of Martin Luther King, we see here that Stokely Carmichael was the chairman of SNCC between 1966 and 1967. He was actually preceded by John Lewis, who is today a congressman. Okay, so he's currently a congressman from Georgia, and so he's currently serving in the House of Representatives. And so Stokely Carmichael was the head of SNCC right after him. But as far as that goes, in 1967 and 68, that he starts getting involved in black nationalism, and a lot of that is just the disillusionment with the progress of the civil rights movement. And so what we want to remember there is kind of like the question we asked earlier about, did the civil rights movement fail? What we want to note here is that in a lot of cases, these were the same people, just at different times. That some former SNCC organizers later on said, you know, I think this black nationalism thing looks pretty good because I'm really frustrated with the way that things have turned out. And so we'll go ahead and go to the next thing. Now, what did I see? I saw a question about Brown v. Board. Okay, and Rhea, we've already kind of alluded to this, and I'm going to go into that. Now, first of all, why did the civil rights era shift into one of militancy? Okay, so when we think about militancy, this was going on for a while. Like if you think about this, like Malcolm X was involved with the Nation of Islam in the late 1950s. So this is something that black nationalism didn't just appear, but it did gain a lot of currency. And remember, this goes down with a lot of the disillusionment. And remember 1968, I would write that year down. 1968, that is the year that Martin Luther King was killed. And of course, his death, quite ironically, Martin Luther King's death was followed by massive rioting. Okay, it was followed by massive rioting, and so that's what we've got. That's what we've got there. That I would say the assassination of Martin Luther King. I would say that that's it, but it's been going on a little more than that. Notice that Stokely Carmichael, he was transitioning out of it beforehand, so it's not just like Martin Luther King was assassinated and then this happened. You got it? All right. So as far as that goes, we're done with that one. How did events in the civil rights era impact tensions between state and federal authority and the formation of new political affiliations? All right, so as I mentioned, you had in 1948 the so-called States' Rights Democratic Party, and this is where, like, a lot of people, when they hear states' rights today, they hear like an undercurrent of racism. Now, I think that to a certain extent that's kind of unfair, because there are a lot of people who are advocates of states' rights for reasons that have nothing to do with race, but we do need to be sensitive to to this period where states' rights was really code for something else. It was like states' rights is saying that we don't want the federal government interfering and doing things that we don't like. Now, as far as that goes, events in the civil rights era. So this is an age of, where the more progressive, more liberal folks are wanting more federal intervention. Okay, more federal intervention in things. And so, first of all, when you think about that, that Brown v. Board, okay, Brown versus the Board of Education reversed a long-standing policy going back to Thoreau. Now, nobody's asking about Brown v. Board. There was a question about Brown v. Board, and it just kind of disappeared, and I don't know what happened there. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and take a look at a few things here, okay, because I want to take a look at Brown v. Board and also want to get into a few other things, okay? Now, Brown versus the Board of Education. The big question here is, does racial segregation violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? And so does racial segregation violate this? And so Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 put forward the separate but equal doctrine, okay? And the separate but equal doctrine says that, railroad cars, okay? So Homer Plessy, who was actually 7/8 white, he was, really had the appearance of a white man, but it was known that he had black blood, the so-called one drop of black blood, and he had to sit in the colored railroad car. And so he sued. And, this is a test case. I mean, they got somebody who was mostly white to sue here. And so the Supreme Court says, no, his rights are not being violated because there is a car for, there is a white car and a colored car, okay, that they exist. Now, if the train were all white, then that would be a problem. And so then you get into, whether it's schools. So as long as there are schools for Black people, schools for white people, as long as there is a bathroom for Black people, a bathroom for white people, then that is not something that is seen as a problem, according to Plessy v. Ferguson. And that was the law of the land for nearly 60 years. And so Brown v. Board overturned the Plessy decision, ruling that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And so segregated schools are in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And you'll want to remember this for AP Government as well if you take that later. Now, as far as that goes also, we want to talk about the Civil Rights Acts, okay? And I'm going to actually play around with the animations on this just a little bit. So that I've got it later on when I want to do that. So the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Okay, so the Civil Rights Act 1957 is basically bark. Okay, that is basically bark is what you're looking at here. That this is like the whole thing was Lyndon Johnson wanted to run for president. And he was actually supported by, Richard Russell, who was, he's a powerful senator from Georgia. And so he had some support in the Southern Caucus that, look, we need to get a civil rights bill passed. But most of the committee chairs were Southerners, and they were against a strong bill. But Lyndon Johnson was able to convince them essentially that you've got to have something, okay, that the public is going to demand some kind of Civil Rights Act, and we need to deliver on that, or else we're going to have to deal with something that's going to be, it's going to be more powerful. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1957, what you want to remember about that is that this is something that's really all bark, no bite. It's like, look, we showed that we could get a bill through the Senate, because there had been efforts for a long time, for decades, like, for example, even in the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge, President Coolidge was asking Congress for an anti-lynching law. Congress never passed an anti-lynching law in the early 20th century. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1957 is important because it was the first federal civil rights bill since Reconstruction. And so that's something that is a matter of importance. And so with that, so let's go ahead. Civil Rights Act of 1957, first federal civil rights bill, passed, weak on enforcement powers. There really wasn't anything enforceable there. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, all of these in the 60s had some bite. That the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination in employment, education, and public accommodations. Okay, so anything to do with schools, anything to do with jobs, like we think about, like, employers say that they're an equal opportunity employer. That's what we've got there. Okay, so employment, education, and public accommodations, such as restaurants, hotels, places like that. Anything that's open to the public cannot discriminate. Then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which banned voter discrimination, things like poll taxes. Now, there's also a constitutional amendment there, and also provided federal oversight for election laws and procedures in some states. Now, that provision is currently inoperable because of a 2013 decision by the Supreme Court, Shelby County versus Holder, which said that they didn't strike down the Article 5 of the Voting Rights Act, but what they did say is that the requirements that they needed to be updated, okay? Because what happened in 2013 is the Supreme Court ruled, I believe this was a 5-4, the Supreme Court ruled that, it's okay for the federal government to say that these states are going to be held, these states, there's going to be some oversight here in these states. Yes, I am screen sharing. Okay, excellent. But let me go ahead and go to the Voting Rights Act, because I want you to understand, like, what's going on here. That what this did was that certain states, states with a history of discrimination, that those states were going to have to be pre-cleared before any changes were made to their election laws. And notice here, that you've got, now you've got Alaska and Arizona. Now, note Arizona, this was Barry Goldwater's home state. Okay, so this was Barry Goldwater's home state. And then they've got some deep South states and then Virginia. So mostly this is affecting the South. And what the Supreme Court ruled in 2013 is that they need to revisit things. Like, you can't continue to say that South Carolina can't change its election laws without federal oversight because of things that happened 50 years ago. That's what the Supreme Court was saying. So the federal government would need to update once in a while. So currently, though, what's important is until Congress passes another, another study or another thing to say, like, look, these are the states where there's recently been discrimination, that part of the Voting Rights Act is currently inoperable. Okay, so that part is currently inoperable, but this was to target states that had a history of not these states that had a history of discriminating in voting. And so then the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was the Fair Housing Act, okay, which prohibited discrimination based on race or disability in the sale or rental of housing. Now, public accommodations, we're talking about, hotels and restaurants and stuff. And now this is about you can't refuse to sell someone a house because of their race or their disability. You can't refuse to rent to someone on that basis. So that's the Fair Housing Act. Now, they've got a lot of other things that you can, that you could do. They've done some studies where they've shown how landlords do tend to discriminate still, but they can't discriminate on that specific basis. All right. So with that, we've got a few things that we've seen over the years, just a few key pieces of legislation, as well as Brown v. Board. And so all of these pieces of legislation are they're, what am I saying here? Let me get my train of thought. All of them are increasing the authority of the federal government over the states when it comes to civil rights. Now, remember, ladies and gentlemen, we shouldn't be using the chat to tell people to upvote. If you want to text your friends and tell them, hey, let's come into the Fiveable session, y'all, go ahead and do that, okay? So yes, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Fair Housing Act 1968. All right, so as far as that goes, now, Leslie, you have asked a question here that is interpretive, okay? You've asked a question that is interpretive. And so when we think about this, like, what I would do here is I would look at the presidents, okay? I would look at Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter. You can look into that. Now, of course, you might kind of stop by, I think that your contenders would be Truman, Eisenhower, probably not so much, okay? Even though Eisenhower did reluctantly enforce the Supreme Court's ruling, sent, troops to Little Rock and that sort of thing. But I don't think Eisenhower would be at the top of the list for civil rights. But Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, okay? I don't think anybody would say that Nixon's a civil rights guy, okay? That Nixon's really kind of like benefiting from some of the resentment that's there. When you look at Nixon's Southern strategy, for example, Nixon realized that, Southern whites were ready to be converted to Republicans. And that's, of course, what's creating the current coalition. And so, which president had the biggest impact? I'd think in terms of LBJ when you look at the legislation, or Harry Truman. JFK certainly deserves some credit for kind of getting the ball rolling as well before he was assassinated. But what we want to do here is I would look at Truman, JFK, and LBJ, and I would figure out, what can you argue? So it's not really for me to tell you what president had the biggest impact, but for you to assemble evidence and figure out who had the biggest impact. All right, so consider that, you're asking an argumentative question. For me, I would probably say LBJ because of all of the legislation that came out under his watch, but certainly Truman deserves some credit for getting the ball rolling. All right, so connected to Malcolm X, is it the other way around? Okay, so, all right, so as far as that goes, now, note that I'm not saying that there is a direct lineage between Booker T. Washington and Malcolm X. But what I am saying here is that what Booker T. Washington and Malcolm X have in common is self-help. For example, like this idea that we're not going to the white community and demanding things, we're trying to help ourselves. Just as an illustration, Marcus Garvey, who would be the father of Black nationalism, I don't classify Booker T. Washington as a Black nationalist or a Black separatist. Booker T. Washington was somebody who was just living in the world that he was in, okay? Whereas W.B. Du Bois wanted to do things to change that world and to change the political interactions. But Booker T. Washington was about like, hey, let's create a college for young Black people and teach them trades, teach them how to be self-sufficient. And so when Marcus Garvey, who was from Jamaica, got to the United States, he said the first thing he did was that he visited the grave of Booker T. Washington. So I think that that's very important when you consider that Marcus Garvey, when he comes to the United States, he visits Booker T. Washington's grave. And then Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois constantly went at it. W.E.B. Du Bois had some respectful disagreements with Booker T. Washington, but he and Marcus Garvey, there was nothing pretty about that rivalry. Marcus Garvey said, had this theory, the way he put it, was he thought the NAACP was trying to create kind of a third caste. Like if you look at South Africa, for example, during apartheid, people were white or they were Black or they were colored. And so that's what Marcus Garvey believed that W.E.B. Du Bois is trying to do. He said that he went in the NAACP office and didn't see a single Black person in there. And so it was a very ugly rivalry between the two. But you see also that W.E.B. Du Bois is trying to integrate, people into society, whereas Marcus Garvey is talking about, he founded the Black Star Line. He had this dream of recolonizing Black people from the Americas back to Africa, the whole Back to Africa movement. And so as far as that, let's see, and it strongly disapproved that condemned. Now, see, I think that condemned, when you say that Du Bois condemned Booker T. Washington, I would say that Du Bois respectfully disagreed with Booker T. Washington. Now, Marcus Garvey, different story, okay? So as far as that goes, I don't know. I would say that, he wasn't friendly to what Booker T. Washington was doing, but he respected him. There was a respect that he certainly didn't have for Garvey. So what I want to invite you to consider is thinking Booker T. Washington to Marcus Garvey to Malcolm X, with each of them becoming really more extreme in this tradition that starts with self-help and then goes into Black nationalism. Hopefully that helps a little bit. Now, the connection between Du Bois and Martin Luther King, I think, is very obvious, okay, because both of them are taking the integrationist approach. But thank you very much, Alan, for asking that question. But yeah, I would say that I would put that through Marcus Garvey as kind of the link between Booker T. Washington and Malcolm X, not a direct link. All right, so as far as that, were all the sit-ins inspired by Thoreau? Now, one thing, Owen, you've got Thoreau, you've also got Leo Tolstoy from Russia, and Gandhi. I would say that the most direct influencer there would be Gandhi. So that theory of civil disobedience, you've got Thoreau, you've got Leo Tolstoy, the author of War and Peace, and then you've got Gandhi. And I think that Martin Luther King was most closely tied to Gandhi. And so as far as that goes, but I would say that, you could trace that. It is the same sort of idea. But then, because really Thoreau is, coming from a transcendentalist perspective, that me personally, if I disagree with the law, I don't have to follow it. So it's really, Thoreau's civil disobedience, I think, is more of an individualistic thing rather than a group effort. All right. Well, Alan, as long as you took the exam already, I think you're going to be okay. All right. So, how did conservatives challenge liberal laws? Okay. Now, as far as that goes, I would say, when Richard Nixon ran for president, Richard Nixon spoke to the silent majority, which we've heard President Trump has used that term in his campaigns, the silent majority. That what we want to note is there definitely was some resentment there for people. And of course, when we think about, something like if y'all have gotten into like Bakke versus California, Bakke versus like regents of the University of California, if we do the whole case, that good question, Rhea, but this is kind of my job. Okay, it's kind of my job. But as far as this goes, if we think, yeah, the knowledge is in the jug, people, stay hydrated. So here's the thing. I mean, this is where we want to consider a number of perspectives. And I think we also need to consider like the perspective of Bakke, who was, a candidate for admission into the University of California Medical School. And he found out that he didn't get in because there was a racial quota. There are only so many. So he's a white male who has tried as hard as anybody else to get into the medical school. And so the medical school had a very strict affirmative action policy. Okay, I tell you what, I need to do. The jug life needs to be a thing, right? It needs to be a t-shirt maybe. But as far as that goes, that he's trying to get into a medical school, and so he sues, and because his qualifications were significantly higher than some of the people they were letting in because of the strict quota system. And so the Supreme Court in Bakke versus California, or Bakke versus Regents, whatever we're talking about, that the Bakke case, right? Bakke, that the Supreme Court said that diversity and race and gender, those can be considered, okay? Those can be considered for admission, but they can't have a strict quota system. And the Supreme Court has constantly, kind of towed that line, that affirmative action. Now, by affirmative action, what we're talking about is, is the civil rights movement just about getting rid of legal barriers, or should affirmative action be taken in order to what they call affirmative action? Because should we kind of tilt the scales a little bit so that in order to create a true equality of opportunity? And you can understand that, a lot of white Americans be resentful about that. Now, one thing I saw in a poll recently, let me make sure that I'm not misquoting this poll. But what we saw very recently is that, let's see, American support for affirmative action. Let's see, interesting here, and I forget what I was looking at here. But let's see, I'm at Gallup polling right now. I'm trying to find something, but actually this isn't going to show me a chart. But just to note that affirmative action is something that has caused its share of controversy. And so Richard Nixon, when it comes down to it, that Nixon is speaking to this silent majority. Like the Supreme Court, there was a decision. It's like Charlotte Mecklenburg. And I forget the other side of that. But what was happening was some districts, in order to desegregate, were busing. Okay, they were busing students, like basically, the white flight after World War II. That after Brown v. Board, people thought, well, we'll just move out of town and we'll move into the suburbs. And so you had these suburban schools, and people kind of escaped it. And so some of these school districts started busing like inner city Black students to the suburbs, and then busing suburban kids into the inner city in order to integrate the schools. And the Supreme Court ruled that they didn't say that busing was required, but they said that busing policies did not violate the Constitution. And so it's stuff like that. They're not overturning these laws, and no one's saying that there shouldn't be equality or anything like that. But there are things like, you'll notice here in the South, sometimes you've got like these strangely shaped school districts. Like, for example, where the city has a school district. I think that Memphis and Tennessee and Huntsville, Alabama, both have this system where the city has its own school system and the county has its school system. And what that does is it insulates the county from the city and stops busing from happening. And because the courts have ruled that you don't, I mean, once a school district is created, then like that school district is insulated. So as far as that goes, it's not so much that any of these things have been repealed, but now I mentioned also in the Supreme Court, Shelby County versus Holder, where the Voting Rights Act is still on the books, but it's been basically gutted. It can't be enforced in its current form without legislation from Congress. So hopefully that helped a little bit. All right. So going into that, that we have here. Now, the other thing is that, when we look at data, I mean, it's not that, I mean, I don't think that there are data to support that minorities have an advantage getting into college, but there is certainly a perception of that, and that's kind of what goes into the Bakke case. So it is important to note, kind of like when you think about we think about legacies of resentment, for example, like U.S. involvement in Latin America during the early 20th century, certainly created a legacy of resentment in Latin America that took the United States a long time to address. Okay, did the Cold War have any impact on the civil rights movements? I love this question, Oscar. Thank you for asking it, because this allows me to talk about JFK a little bit, okay? Because here's the thing, that the United States, like after World War II, becomes the champion of freedom in the world, all right? And I tell you, by the time I get to JFK, if I get there at all, I don't have enough time. It's like I can get into the Cold War and then like, bam, the exam, y'all know how it is. So when it comes down to it, that JFK was very staunchly anti-communist. I would definitely recommend listening to JFK's first inaugural address, his Berlin Wall speech, his Rice University speech about the moon, his American University speech about world peace, all kinds of stuff, ladies and gentlemen. But the Cold War, when you think about it, the United States is promoting freedom in the world, and we don't have our own house in order, okay? So when it comes down to it, like, I don't know if any of y'all are into Jordan Peterson's work, but he talks about how, when people are concerned about, changing society, but they can't even make their bed, it's like you can't make your own bed, you can't clean your own room. Like, why don't you clean your own room first, and then you can worry about everyone else, okay? And so that's the thing, that do that first. And so the United States, like communists, were actually using propaganda, like showing how, yeah, I mean, America's got United States has all kinds of racial problems, and it's not really a free country. So with John F. Kennedy, I think, him being such a champion of freedom in the world, and so fervently and staunchly anti-communist, that there is this kind of hypocrisy about the whole thing. That why are we promoting freedom in the world if we don't have freedom here in this country for everybody? So yes, I think that certainly the whole idea that we're fighting communism is, and we're seeing ourselves as the virtuous champions of freedom in the world, that's something that definitely, I believe, had an effect on the civil rights movement. I think that when you look at JFK and his philosophy, I think that really goes into that when it comes down to it, like, look, we're trying to get rid of communism because it's a system that makes people poor, but we have poor people in our own country, and those poor people are largely ethnic minorities. And so as far as that goes, yes, quoting Jesus, Katie, I think that is relevant here, taking the speck out of your, taking the plank out of your eye, instead of taking the speck out of your brother's eye. Or your sibling's eye, if we're going to use 21st century gender neutral language, right? Did the civil rights movement begin as okay, so as far as that goes, that Ellie, I think that you are onto something here. Like, what we have to think about is in the 1850s, for example, there were a lot of Americans in the North who were uncomfortable with slavery, like they weren't big fans of it, but abolitionism in the 1850s was even strange to most people in the North. Like, remember that the free soil philosophy was had much more currency with Northern whites, which basically just about everybody in the North was white at this time. And so they believed, like, as long as slavery doesn't spread, then whatever. And that was the point of view there. Thank you so much, Jessica, for the kind words. So what we have to keep in mind is that 100 150 years ago, there were a lot of Americans who did not think that slavery was, was necessarily, 100, let's go back 160 now. So I've got to use, I'm getting old, I've got to use more, new terms. So when you think about that there were people who didn't have a problem with slavery. And so when you think about racial segregation, that was just what was. And we have to remember as well, like I said, that FDR, his administration funded the Tuskegee Airmen in order to see, can a black man fly a plane? So what you had, before World War II was a great deal of what's called scientific racism. And thank you for your vote, Rhea. But scientific racism, most Americans felt that black people were inferior, that white people were inherently superior to all other non-white people and cultures. And we have to remember, too, that it wasn't until like 1960, I believe, that the UN released its, the UN Declaration on Colonial Independence. Let's see what this is called. The United Nations, Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. This was in 1960. Okay, so as far as that goes, that it was in 1960 that the UN passed that resolution, which said that, it's not okay to have colonies based on the idea that the people in that colony are not advanced enough to handle freedom. And so with that, we've got to remember that it's really until, it's going on. I mean, if you think about, there are people alive today that still have these viewpoints, especially in the older generation. So yes, I think that what you're looking at there is, and we have to think about too, televisions, okay, that because of televisions in the 1950s are starting to get in people's households. Now people are able to see what's going on in Birmingham and other places like that. So I think that what you're doing here, I think that Harry Truman was really taking a risk. Like when he did what he did, this is something that was going against public opinion at the time. Truman was somebody who was kind of a visionary, a man of courage. And I think that when you're going through that, it takes a while. So I think that even, LBJ was fighting an uphill battle to an extent, but he was a very brilliant legislator. And he knew, having been the majority leader of the U.S. Senate, he knew how the legislative process worked. And so he was able to do that. But I think that this is one of those things that it's a question that, if that really remains to be seen. But generational outlooks certainly change, from generation to generation.